Thank you all for joining the 10th Annual Tribal Healing to Wellness Court Virtual Enhancement Training. You've joined session D5, entitled When Sanctions Don't Work, Responding to Addiction-Driven Behavior. This workshop will be presented by Terrence Walton. My name is Jordan Martinson with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I am a Tribal Law and Policy Specialist with the Institute. I'm joined by Janice Thompson, Program Assistant with TLPI, and she'll be walking us through a few tech-related notes for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Recordings will be available in this virtual space and on enhancementtraining.org. Again, thank you for joining us. I will now turn it back over to today's presenter to begin.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is so good to see. It's good to be with you, sort of. Good to be together, sort of together. Thank you, first of all, to TLPI for the invitation to not just address this conference, but to address this conference on this really important topic. And it is important. You know that that's why you're here. In fact, you know, if I were forced to identify the 2 or 3 things that matter most in treatment court, you know, I would try to say, well, hey, all 10 key components, and I go through all the elements of the standards. But if I were forced to narrow it down to just 2 or 3, I can assure you our coordinated responses to behavior that we describe as incentives, sanctions, and therapeutic adjustments or contingency management would be among the top 2 or 3 things that I believe most impact behavior change, sustained behavior change in drug courts. And, you know, listen, we know a lot about this. This should work. You know, I've been training on this topic for a long time. And more recently, I developed this presentation because in addition to the training that I do as the Chief Operating Officer of the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, you know, I don't just help our CEO, Carson Fox, run this office. I also spend probably in regular times 40% of my time out in the field, training groups large and small, working with teams, sometimes individually, to work through issues, especially related to either effective treatment, because I'm a treatment professional, or incentives and sanctions. And I soon realized that a lot of times there are programs who are well-meaning, who are doing, you know, great work in most areas, who aren't getting the full impact of that they could get from contingency management, from incentives and sanctions. And so I developed this presentation initially to say when sanctions don't work, and soon expanded it to sanctions and incentives and the whole piece. When it doesn't work, what is that about? And often it's about our ability, the need to respond more effectively to non-compliance, not when it's just willful, but when it's addiction driven. And so that's what we're going to do today. We'll talk I'll say a tiny bit about, you know, the science behind this. I'll then spend some time really identifying just some of the way we really look at contingency management. I'll describe in general what the strategy is for responding to behaviors in treatment courts of all types across this country and elsewhere. And then I'll get right to the chase. You know, we're gonna, you know, this is gonna go fast, but we have a lot of material. So I will, in case at the end things get rushed, I'm gonna tell you up front the top reasons I have found where sanctions and additionally incentive sanctions and our overall approach sometimes doesn't work. I'll tell you what I think those reasons are and outline for you fairly early what I believe the solutions are based on the evidence I've seen, based on research, based on practice wisdom. And so that's how we'll do this. Then we will spend the last section of this presentation talking really about, well, how do you adjust treatment if in response to behavior that's not getting better? Because you will see that sometimes that's what it's about. It's about the fact it's not about any weakness in our strategy, no weakness in our response strategy, but it's about the fact that addiction is getting in the way and stopping people from being able to respond as they normally would to our behavior modification. So that's what we'll do today. Let's get started. So again, this is old science. This isn't something we just came up with. This is something that didn't begin at all with treatment courts. This dates back to the early 1900s. You're gonna remember some of this from your Psych 101 classes. If you had any names like B.S. Skinner and Watson and others, really established that there is a direct connection between behaviors and the environment, between things that happen in the environment and resulting behaviors, and behaviors that occur and consequences to those behaviors that can make that behavior more or less likely to occur. And you may remember it this way, that there really are two different kinds of reinforcement, two different ways of conditioning. And conditioning means learning. One way is classical conditioning. And classical conditioning occurs when the person, in this case, behaves in a certain way. I'm sorry, let me say it differently. Classical conditioning occurs when something happens that triggers a behavior. Something happens that triggers a behavior, or a thought, or a feeling, and then a behavior. In the treatment court world, we use the science of classical conditioning for the most part when we are doing relapse prevention planning. All of you have worked to help your participants, your families, your individuals to identify the things that trigger behaviors. That's based on, and then work on how you intervene between the trigger and the behavior. That's based on early 1900s classical conditioning, experiments done with animals initially. The kind of learning, the kind of conditioning that relates to our incentives and sanctions is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning. And in operant conditioning, the behavior happens. The person behaves in a certain way, and we respond, the environment, and that's us right now, respond in a certain way that makes that behavior either more likely or less likely to happen. And everything we do in terms of incentives and sanctions is based on that concept. Proven science, tested over and over again for decades. Initially with rats and monkeys and gerbils, I don't know, but eventually in people. And so it should work. It should work. We should be able to, behavior should occur, and if we do the right things, in response to that behavior, it should make it more or less likely to occur. It's how all of us, it's at least one of the ways that all of us learn to behave the way we do. There are other elements too. There's some other pieces involved, of course. Nothing's that simple. But one strong determinant of our behavior is the responses that happen in our environment. And so what I want to do now is really describe how we apply contingency management or incentives and sanctions in the treatment court environment. So keep this in mind. There are two ways to either encourage, discourage, or treat any behavior. I want you to think about the people you work with, your participants, and that at any given time, they may exhibit behaviors that we want to encourage. We want to see more of that. It's for their good and the good of the communities they live in. There are other times we want to discourage behaviors because it's not going to help them, not going to help their communities. And then sometimes we're seeing behaviors that we just need to treat, that we want things to get better, but we need to treat that behavior. And you can encourage behavior, discourage behavior, or treat behavior either by adding something or taking something away, either by starting something or stopping something. Here's what we mean by that. So in our environment, there are three ways we respond to behaviors in treatment courts: with incentives, with sanctions, or with some kind of change in treatment. Now, we know that everyone gets treatment. We know that if you're in treatment court, you're going to receive treatment. There'll be an initial assessment, a decision will be made about among the available treatment options that are out there, available in your communities, in the communities where the participant lives, what is the best course for them. They'll begin that treatment, and hopefully it works well. Hopefully they're able to reach their treatment plan goals. They're able to avoid any criminal activity. They're able over time to develop the ability to live without substances and enter recovery. Hopefully they'll be restored with their families and become more effective parents and children and more responsible members of their communities. Hopefully those things will happen. Hopefully they'll be able to find and keep gainful employment. Hopefully that happens. And if those kind of things are happening, even the little steps that lead up to those big things, the little steps that lead up to getting the job, the little steps that lead up to being able to establish 90 days without using substances. When we see those little steps that are in the right direction, that suggest the person's making even incremental progress toward the ultimate goal, we want to reward that. We want to incentivize that. And we can do that by either adding something or increasing something or doing something or saying something that they like, that's desirable. Or we can also reward that behavior, that tiny progress or big progress, by removing things or reducing things or saying things that they don't like hearing or don't like. You can reward that. Think about yourself. You know, if you wanted to reward someone in your life, you could give them something that they want, large or small, something that they find desirable. Or you could take something away that they find desirable. I'm sorry, that's wrong. Or you could remove something that they find as undesirable. Let me get this right. This is too important. Yeah, you can reward them by giving them something they like. Or you can reward them by taking away something they don't like. Let's say if the behavior you're seeing, you don't want it to continue. You need that behavior to reduce for their own good and the good of all, and eventually eliminate. In that case, you can sanction or you can discourage behavior by either adding something, doing something, or saying something they don't like, or removing something or saying something that they do like. We'll look at some examples in a minute. And then with therapeutic adjustments, it is not about either rewarding or punishing. It's just about treating. It's just about what they need. You know, I have small children. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they both just turned 7 and 4. And my daughter, my 7-year-old, you know, when she was very small, had lots and lots of ear infections. Eventually, they had to put tubes in her ears. But before then, we were doing the ear drops and stuff, and she hated it, by the way. So it felt like a punishment to her. But it wasn't meant to punish her. And it wasn't a punishment. It was because it's what she needed. And when she got better, we were able to stop doing that. That also wasn't to reward her, by the way. It was because she didn't need it. And so the first thing I want to encourage you, if you haven't done it already, is if you have some list somewhere of your incentives and sanctions, I hope there's a third list of the kinds of changes you might make to treatment in response to behavior. Because what my program that I used to help, the drug court I helped run in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, at first we just had 2 lists. And things like additional treatment groups, or going from intensive outpatient to residential treatment, adding some new treatment activity, those kind of things that we would do if people were having trouble stopping using substances, we had those on the sanction list. that was a part of our list of sanctions, and that's not okay, because those aren't sanctions, those aren't punishments. Like my daughter hated those eardrops, so it felt like a punishment, but that wasn't what it was. It's because of what she needed. And so we can't completely control whether a person wants to go to treatment or not, or views the treatment referral, treatment activity as positive or negative, but we can help to set the tone by being sure we don't have treatment activities listed as sanctions. And when a judge or a provider or a case manager or whoever is describing treatment changes to the participant, because they're having trouble either showing up for treatment or having trouble reducing their use, then they make it clear that, yes, you've had these positive tests, you received this sanction, and now we want to help you more. So we're going to change your treatment to adjust you because we don't like having to sanction you. So first big takeaway, be sure if you have compiled a list of potential incentives and sanctions, please also have a list of potential therapeutic adjustments. And there shouldn't be, and treatment stuff shouldn't be on the sanction list, and nor should it be on the incentives list. We don't move a person to a higher phase in treatment as a reward to them. I mean, it is rewarding. We do it because now they're ready to work on different things. All right, let's keep moving. Here's some examples of the kinds of responses we do to encourage behavior in treatment courts. You see that kind of stuff there. The adding something desirable as a reward is called positive reinforcement. Those are examples that you see there. Most of these are obvious. Just in case you're not sure what is meant by fishbowl drawing, that essentially means that because most programs can't afford to do a lot of tangible awards, and for, as we'll talk about in a minute, for incentives to really be effective, you need to be doing them fairly frequently. And so again, in my drug court for a long time, most of our incentives happen at progression time, like as they move from one phase to the other. But that's not how this works. In order for contingency management to work, in order for behavior modification to work in this context, the behavior needs to be closely associated with the reward. And so waiting 3-4 months or even 3-4 weeks for them to get to the next phase was too late to be, we need to be reinforcing rewarding before that. So you want to look for opportunities to reward small incremental progress. And so part of how some people do that is they have like a fishbowl of some kind. We used a bingo barrel. And maybe inside that fishbowl, there are lots of strips of paper. And that strips of paper many of them have great job, we're proud of you, keep it up, you can do this. Lots of inspirational brief messages. But some of those have great job, and because of that, here is a $5 or $10 gift certificate. And based on budget, you decide how many of those things you can put in there that actually have some tangible value. But the research shows that even just being able to reach in and draw something out of the fishbowl, that in itself is rewarding. That causes feel-good chemicals to be released in the brain. Just the potential of winning something pretty nice, that in itself is rewarding. It's, the opportunity to win, the opportunity for reward is reinforcing. It is rewarding just the chance of winning. It's probably how casinos work. That most people don't really win, in the long run in casinos, but it's exciting and fun to the prospect of winning. Well, so you could put as many things in the fishbowl as you want. You can give people opportunities to pull from it as often as you want without breaking the bank, because you decide how many things of value are on that slip of paper. And in our program, and in some other programs I've seen, every court date, if the person has a good court report, they can reach in and pull one out. Some programs do it differently, that every time people have a good report, they can drop their name in, and their name can be in more and more times. And then someone pulls a name out, as many names as they can pull out and can afford to pull out, and that person gets some reward. So again, you may already know about that, but it's a really good way to be able to reward frequently without breaking the bank. Again, as we mentioned, you can reward by also removing something that the person experiences as undesirable. Now, it may not be meant to be that way, but if they don't like doing it, if it takes time, if it infringes on their freedom, on their, on their money, then you can reduce those things they experience as negative in order to reward them for doing well. For instance, perhaps they have a curfew for 8 p.m. every day, and as a reward for good behavior, you give them a curfew for 9 p.m. and you tell them that's why they're getting this later curfew. Or perhaps you have a program that has fees, and as a reward for good behavior, you can waive the fees, removing that burden, removing that debt, which is people like. All kinds of things can be listed there. I do want, though, to encourage you to be careful with negative reinforcement, because oftentimes what we do in a lot of drug courts, their main incentives are negative reinforcements. For instance, they will reduce the number of court appearances. They may reduce the frequency of contact with the case manager or the PSO as a reward. And you have to be careful doing that, because sometimes the reason they're doing well is because of those things. And so it's far better, especially at the beginning, in the initial weeks and sometimes months of treatment, to let most of your rewards be positive reinforcement and leave the requirements the same for a while until they are more stable and ready to move forward. You can also discourage behavior in the same two ways. Adding something or increasing something that the person experiences as undesirable is known as traditionally as punishment. It's not meant to just be punishing, it's meant to be therapeutic. This, by the way, what I'm describing is a treatment intervention. Incentives, sanctions in this environment is really a treatment intervention. It's not meant to be punitive at all, not punitive for its own sake. It is meant to discourage behavior, to be quick, to be able to be experience whatever the punishment is. It shouldn't last long. You want them to receive the sanction and then get back to trying to do the right thing. So these are examples of doing something or increasing something the person doesn't like. Verbal reprimands, done correctly, those can be really effective if coming from someone that, like the judge or others, just letting the person know this isn't okay. You need to show up for treatment no matter what. And you see other examples. Maybe the person is given an early curfew as a punishment. Maybe they had a later curfew, and now because of behaviors you're seeing, now they get an earlier curfew. Again, you can also discourage behavior by removing something that they like. And that's kind of called a response cost. You don't have to remember what these things are called, but some people want to know. That's called a response cost in the behavior modification world. Something like if you have a point system, some programs have a point system where people earn points for doing different things, and then when they get so many points, they get some reward for that. A way of discouraging behavior or sanctioning by removing something desirable will be losing some of those points. Maybe if they had been reduced to coming to court only once a month, now maybe they are returned to more frequent appearances. Maybe they have to come every other week now in response to behavior, and so on and so on. And the last category is also there, and that is paying fines. Sometimes because paying fines is removing money, and all of us find money desirable, that is a way of responding to behavior to discourage it by removing something desirable. But you see what's in red there. Be careful with that, because people who can't afford to be paid fines, if people can't afford to pay fines, you should never use that. We have a problem in treatment courts where there are lots of fines, and people who don't have who aren't rich or middle class can't afford drug court. That's a really significant problem. So do not use paying fines as a sanction for people who can't afford it. Use something else. And then it's about treating behavior. And this is the stuff, maybe they need a new assessment. Maybe we're going to add some trauma recovery groups, or maybe it's time to enhance their peer support work, their recovery management work. Maybe they were in intensive outpatient, and then they need to go to residential because they're struggling. Maybe their environment is too toxic and they can't break free even for a few days. So not as a punishment, though they might not like it, but as giving them what they need. You might move them up to residential. Perhaps maybe you're going to add to them some new interventions that are more culturally relevant. When I was doing direct services, a lot of the people that we served were people of color, young men mostly, and they weren't fully benefiting from our program. And so we found interventions that were really focused on issues that people of color face and systemic problems, and we address their substance use and their delinquent behavior from the context of their own culture, and helping them to explore how elements in their culture has made these behaviors more or less likely. We just changed the focus some and were more deliberate in being sure that we're speaking to the realities that they faced. Again, all kinds of things can happen to enhance treatment if people are needing more. By the same token, if people are doing well, they're becoming stabilized, they're making progress, then you can reduce things, not to reward them, but because they need less or need different. It's typical that treatment programs, as the person progresses through the treatment program, that they will advance to phases or stages where they don't report to treatment as often. They don't report to the treatment center as often. They don't see the counselor as often, because hopefully they're more engaged in recovery management in their own communities. They're spending more time with their recovery coaches or their peer mentors, or going to meetings designed to help peers, helping other peers get well. That's what you want. You eventually want them doing much more of that, because at some point, a treatment court ends. At some point, healing to wellness court ends. And so you want them well connected in whatever resources in their communities will support them being well. And you want them to do more and more of that. In fact, in the final phase of our program in my old drug court, in that final phase, we would allow all kinds of activities to substitute for coming to our treatment center. We would allow for the young people who are trying to get their GEDs, we would allow them going through their classes to replace some treatment groups. For individuals who are trying to reunify with their children, we would allow their parenting time, their home visits, to substitute for some treatment groups, because we were working hard to immerse them in their community in a positive way, and they'd had lots of treatment, and they were doing well, were stabilized, and were ready to gradually transition out of professional treatment. Now, that's a dog. All right. If I could see you, and if I was in a room with you, I'd ask you, anybody have a dog out there, a cat or whatever? Well, I don't have a dog. I don't have any pets, because my wife doesn't believe that animals belong in the house, even pets, like a little dog or whatever. She said they should be outside in a dog house. Well, I was raised with a dog, and that dog was a part of our family. So my wife and I, for 20 years have been in an impasse. So therefore, I don't get a dog, because I won't have a dog outside and she won't have a dog inside. But when I was a kid, we had a dog. He was tough too. His name was Tuffy. He was a Pomeranian. His name was Tuffy. I have two brothers, and when we got the little puppy, that was 4 of us. There was 4 kids, me, my brothers, and Tuffy. And we got Tuffy as a puppy. And when you get a puppy, what's one of the first things you got to do? You have to housebreak them. You have to help them to go outside to take care of their business. And so there's lots of ways to do that. And this was a long time ago, and we did it probably not the right way. We didn't know as much as people know now, and we house broke our puppy the way we learned to do it. Not the best way, but we did what we did. So what we did was we used newspaper. So, and we didn't read it to him. What we did was I wish I had a newspaper in here to show us so we take the newspaper and we would roll it up into kind of like a paper club. And if he would urinate in the house or whatever, we would kind of press his nose down towards it, give him a couple swats with that newspaper club, and then put him outside. And we do that over and over again. And guess what? It worked. Soon, yes, he was terrified of newspaper, but he stopped urinating and other stuff in the house. It worked. But if you think about it, when you have three little kids and a little dog, you want more from the dog. You don't just want the dog to stop urinating in the house. You want the dog to do what? Like tricks. You want them to do new things. You want to teach them how to roll over and play dead and beg and fetch. And so now when it was time for us to get Tuffy to do some new stuff, you think the newspaper would work? Could we take that club and say, roll over, fetch? No, he just cowered and ran away. In order to get Tuffy to do some new stuff, new tricks, what did it take? It took treats. We had to give him, when he would do something or almost do, we give him a little treat. And that's what worked. Soon, because Pomeranians are super smart dogs, Poms are super smart dogs, he was doing all kind of stuff to get that treat. And so here is the message of this story. Here is the lesson. A newspaper is okay to get the puppy to stop doing something, but not to start doing something. It's okay. Maybe there are other ways too, and you probably have a better way of doing it, but it worked. But it didn't help at all when it was time for him to do new stuff. For him to do new stuff, he needed treats. And that's the point. That's the point. That for behavior change to happen and be lasting, people need both. They need both sanctions, both incentives and sanctions. Sanctions can be helpful sometimes to stop and slow down behaviors, to get people's attention, to get them to take it seriously. But incentives, the treats, is where you get new behaviors, lasting behaviors, where people can sustain their progress. So when Tuffy did the wrong thing, he got a little punishment. When he did the right thing, he got a treat. And when he was sick, he got medicine. 3 categories. All 3 matter: incentives, sanctions, and therapeutic adjustments. So I hope you got that. Take a deep breath. Let's transition now to 6 reasons sanctions don't work. And by the way, I'm watching the clock. I hope there'll be time at the end for a few questions. So there might not be, but I hope there will be. So if you have some questions, go ahead and chat them in now. Jordan is helping us out. Jordan, who you heard from a little while ago, he's looking at those chats, and his questions come in. He's going to make note of them. And if we have some time at the end, he's going to read me some of those to try and answer for you. So don't wait till the end to do that, because we'll be in a mad rush. Please go ahead and chat in any questions you might have. 6 reasons why sanctions don't work. And this might be why it's not working for a particular participant, a particular person, or it might be why in general it looks like your sanctions aren't working. Like you've been tracking averages and you've been tracking whether people respond to your sanctions or don't over time, groups of people, and you find the response rate is not good. So it could mean either thing. So here's one reason. When that sanction is injurious, shaming, or experienced as unfair. When that's the case, so many negative emotions, resentments, and shame get experienced by the person that they that the brain focuses on how awful the sanction is, or how shamed they're being made to feel, that the brain doesn't focus on the underlying behavior. So it doesn't work when it's injurious, shaming, or unfair. So no matter what the sanction is, be respectful. Some of the most effective treatment court judges I have observed, treatment court, including wellness to healing court judges, I've observed absolutely sanction, but do so with kindness, gentleness, and respect. That doesn't make the sanction less effective. It makes it more effective. Second reason, when the sanctions are used in the absence of incentives, both pieces are needed. In fact, the research says that if you had to choose, if you could only do incentives or sanctions and you couldn't do both, you'd be far better off to do incentives. Far better off. Incentives is really what brings about lasting behavior change. In fact, we recommend that programs try to get to a 4-to-1 ratio. That means on average, for every sanction you're doing, you should be doing 4 incentives. Now, if you're nowhere near that, then try to get to a 2-to-1 ratio. So for every sanction, you're doing 2 incentives and work your way up to that 4-to-1. There's some research to suggest that that's a good balance to get the best immediate and sustained results. Number 6, sanctions don't work when they are not associated with the actual underlying behavior. If the person's brain doesn't connect what is the consequence with my behavior, it doesn't work. Because I should have told you something. This kind of learning, this kind of conditioning doesn't happen in the conscious brain. It happens in the subconscious brain, or what Freud would call the unconscious brain. That means it's learning that happens automatically outside the person's will. So it doesn't matter whether the person, has a high intellect or not. It doesn't matter whether they are used to thinking about stuff and weighing them out. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter entirely whether or not they have some substance use related impairment for a while, because these are underlying processes that work in the subconscious. So for that to work, the subconscious brain needs to connect what I did or what I didn't do, like skipping groups and not showing up for drug testing, with the sanction that I received. And there's lots of ways to do that. One of the ways to do it is to be sure that they are happening close together, as close as you can get it. If the closer the sanction is to the behavior, the more likely that sanction is to be effective. It's also important, if you're the judge or someone else who is actually imposing the sanction, then you should say really clearly what you're sanctioning them for. If they have tested positive for a substance and they have been untruthful about it, you may be sanctioning the dishonesty much more than the use. If they are living with addiction and still struggling to achieve abstinence, that's a symptom of their disorder. That's because of their addiction. But if they're not telling the truth about it, or if they're just, in addition to testing positive, they also have been skipping groups, then you want to say, listen, I know you're struggling. You're newer in the program. I know you're struggling to try and get some days, to avoid using. And I want you to keep trying to do the best you can. But this sanction is because you didn't tell us the truth. We had to drug test you in order to find out, and then you denied it even then. And I see here from the record, you have only been to one group in the last 3 weeks. So that's what this sanction is for. So say it, so it at least connects in their conscious mind what is being sanctioned. Don't assume they're clear. Another way to be sure, another reason sanctions don't work is when the misbehavior, the infraction, is not reliably detected and addressed. So you want to be sure that you know people's attendance, that you have relationships with your treatment providers, where you, the court, the supervision officer, the case manager, the advocate, whoever is helping the person do the right thing, the defense attorney, whoever is working with the participant to help them comply, they need to know right away if the person is not in treatment. Not so they can be punished right away, but so we can quickly connect with them and encourage them to show up and remind them how important it is that they do it. If the person is struggling and still using substances, we need to know if that's happening as soon as possible. So we need to be testing regularly and randomly, and then address it as quick as we can. If you only have court every other week, then you want to find some way of addressing sanctions in between court dates. Because remember, the behavior and the response need to be close together. Some programs have found ways to do that by doing virtual court hearings in between just to deal with the sanction. Some programs have done so, maybe they really can't actually address it, but they at least detect it and they let the participant know right away where this has happened. I want you to come in, talk to treatment right away. We'll deal with it in court at the next court date. Do whatever you can to be able to, if you have a week or more, or even days in between court dates to address sanctions to address infractions in between court dates if you can. Number 5, sanctions don't work when the sanction is not undesirable. I remember, we had in our program, we had something we called Redirection Group, and we intended that to be a sanction. And it was a group where people, for people who had been having infractions, either they're not showing up for group or more frequently continue to test positive. And they went to this group. And the reason why we assumed this would be a good sanction is because the group was on Friday night. And no participant wants to be up in our treatment center on Friday night. And so we did that for a while. And eventually we did focus groups or something. And we discovered that participants loved going to that group. They loved it. The facilitator was a contractor who we brought in to do the Friday night group for us because I didn't want to make any of my staff work Friday night. And she was great. She was warm. She was affirming. And she brought in like pizza and stuff for the groups. So we soon realized, wait a minute, this isn't a sanction. We'll make this as a treatment group because that's treatment. And we had to use other things because the sanction needs to be something that's undesirable. Please understand that. It might also be therapeutic. You may be giving them community service that they don't like having to do, but maybe it's community service doing something really valuable that teaches them how to give back and be of service. So it can still be of therapeutic value, but it does need to be something that's undesirable. Otherwise, it's not a sanction. But it's even more frequently, sanctions don't work when they're too severe. When it's a jail sanction and you've gotten to that sanction way too soon, or they're staying way too long, or you sanction them for behaviors they cannot control yet. That sanction is sure not to work in that circumstance. And when that participant has little or nothing to lose, then sanctions are less likely to have effect. Doesn't mean you don't try them, but because this person maybe is having a tough life, that they're already in pain, they're already suffering, your sanction is just going to pile on. For some of our participants, for many that I've worked with, and you too, that there isn't any sanction we can do which is worse than what life has already dealt them. So for that person, sanctions really are probably not gonna be what helps them correct their behavior. You wanna maximize incentives for them. You find as many examples, tiny examples of them doing or almost doing the right thing, and affirm that. Even if that affirmation is verbal praise. It's just saying, I know you're trying, I see you showing up now for 2 groups in a row, good job. Verbal praise is a very effective reinforcement. as is applause for most people. So in summary, when sanctions don't work, be respectful when selecting and imposing sanctions. Be sure you're being respectful. Be sure you're using more incentives than sanctions. When sanctions aren't working, be sure you are connecting the behavior and the response deliberately, on purpose, overtly. When sanctions don't work, be sure that you are detecting infractions consistently and addressing them quickly, as quick as you can. None of us can be there a lot of times when the person is about to drink. We're not that intrusive usually, but as quickly as you can, you need to be seeing them regularly enough, screening them regularly enough so that you are likely to detect it and be able to respond to it, even if it's a verbal reprimand, quickly. You might need to add more moderate level sanctions. Maybe you have too many low level sanctions. And if there are too many low level sanctions, something called the habituation, takes effect, where the person isn't moved by the sanction because it's too low level. You may want to start there, but you can't stay there too long. And if it's too severe, then the person it loses much of the benefit because the focus is on the sanction instead of their underlying behavior. So if that's the case for you on either end, you probably need to adjust the intensity of your reactions. You need to reduce the use of jail probably and add more moderate level sanctions if you only have a lot of low level ones. And then finally, when sanctions don't work, you almost certainly are going to need to focus more or mostly on incentives and treatment adjustments for the participant who is already really suffering in multiple areas in life. If they are suffering in multiple areas of life, if you know what recovery capital is, and we don't have time to talk about it today, but if that person has low recovery capital, if they're suffering in many areas of life, then you really want to focus mostly on incentives, treatment adjustments, and services to get some response. Now that's about sanctions, but let's look at our responses in general, whether it be sanctions, incentives, or treatment responses. Here are some but first, look at that. Yeah, I forgot about this one. Take a look at that. Look at that picture. Sanctions can be important to get sort of in the short term to get some behavior change kind of for now. It's important for that. But sanctions don't really work at all. Punishment doesn't work for long-term change for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is because look at this right here. This person, they got to stand still right here. They can stand still. I don't know how long they can just sit here because they can't go left, right? They sit there. They might make a U-turn in the wrong direction. That's all that's left for them. So just like we said with Tuffy, my dog, that, punishment or sanctions, they can work to get, people to stop doing things for a while. But they can't teach people to do new things. For a person to begin doing new things, you need treats and treatment. So we talked about when sanctions don't work. Now let's look at responses in general, whether it be sanction, incentive, or a treatment response. When any collection of our responses aren't working for us, and again, that might mean that there's a particular participant or category of participants like young males or women or whatever, a particular participant or category of participants who just don't seem to be either succeeding in our program where they eventually drop out or we have to kick them out, or they're just having to be sanctioned over and over again and we're not seeing results. Or maybe it's across the board. that we are tracking our numbers. We are looking at how often we sanction. We're looking at success rates, and we're saying we don't think we're getting the full benefit of incentives and sanctions as we should. So if that's the case, I've narrowed down to 4 big reasons. And you know, I've been in the treatment field for 30 years. For as long as I've done anything, I've been involved either in the treatment of addiction or helping people who are helping people by treating them. And I've been in drug courts for about 17 years. So I've seen many, many, many examples. Here are the 4 reasons I believe. Sometimes it's just not enough time. That we just, you know, change takes time. And many of our participants have complex issues that have existed for a very long time, maybe for their entire existence. And so it takes time. And sometimes if we don't have lived experience, if we haven't lived in their shoes, if we haven't walked in their path, then we might expect things to get better sooner. So sometimes we just need to be patient. Other times, it really isn't about our incentives and sanctions. There's some other deficiency in our program. There's something else that's missing that has nothing to do with incentives and sanctions. Maybe the court piece isn't working. They say drug court is theater. That means things should happen in court that the participant learns from and others do. Maybe there's something missing. Maybe, you know, the treatment's inadequate. Maybe they're not getting the treatment they need to get better. There may be some deficiency that has nothing to do with our response strategy. Sometimes it is the strategy. It is we're just not doing incentives and sanctions in the right way. Those things I've talked about before, the fact that the behavior and the consequence needs to be close together, the fact that the sanction can't be too severe. Maybe we've got those things wrong and we're not identifying and responding quick enough. Maybe we're relying too heavily on sanctions and not rewarding incremental progress. Maybe our strategy is wrong. Or maybe we got a great strategy on paper. Maybe in the manual, it looks just fine. It looks just great in the manual, but in practice, we're not executing it. We're not actually doing what our strategy says to do. And the one we'll focus on for our remaining time is this reason right here. Sometimes our response strategy isn't working because of the severity of the substance use and or mental health disorder. Sometimes they are so ill, so disordered right now. They can get better. You know, both addiction and mental health problems are treatable. And through treatment and recovery management, people get better. But maybe where they are when we encounter them, when our paths cross, maybe it's just too severe, that they are too ill. Their brain, their spirit, their emotions are too damaged right now. That they can't even receive our incentives. They can't internalize it. They may have so much shame in them that they don't feel rewarded and affirmed even when we're trying to. Maybe they want to do the right thing. I have worked with so many people who I could tell were doing the best, but they just couldn't stop getting high. Just too severe. Maybe there's a mental health disorder that is interfering with them and sabotaging their efforts. Maybe their disorder is so severe. Maybe they've been addicted so long that no matter what they say to you, and no matter what you say to them, they don't think they can get better. Maybe everyone in their family is struggling with alcohol or some other drug. Maybe for generations that's been the case. That's been their heritage, not all of their heritage. For even those of us who are in the worst shape, there are many things in our heritage which are wonderful. But for some of us, and I'm one of them, there's just generations of alcoholism and addiction. And so sometimes, folks, that's what it is. That we're doing the best we can. We have a good strategy. We have a good program, but the disorders are just so severe. So that's why, unlike most kinds of contingency management, in the treatment court world, in the healing to wellness court world, the our response is always includes when we're seeing behaviors that we don't like or that aren't good for the person or are good for the person, we also always consider treatment, especially when the person's not doing well. If they are struggling to achieve abstinence, or if they're in outpatient treatment and their life is so unmanageable, they can't show up reliably. Then we always look at, is there something we should be doing differently in treatment? We understand we have limited means. We know we don't have all the resources we wish we did, but there's no way to do treatment court effectively. To treat people who have severe substance use disorder and often co-occurring disorders, including the impacts of a lifetime of trauma, personal trauma, cultural trauma, generational trauma, systemic traumas, community-based trauma, trauma from abuse that they have experienced or witnessed, trauma from living in a dangerous environment where anything can happen. Sometimes we have to look at, is there something else we can be doing to address their traumas, their disorders, because that's what's stopping them from responding. And so this is where our treatment providers, our social workers, our case managers, our service workers, this is where they kick in to try and, if a person is having trouble and we've given it enough time and they're just not responding, then we try and figure out, is there something else how else can we help them? What can we change or increase or switch up to help them get better? For many people, if you are treating high need folks with severe disorders, then it's very likely that number 4 is a part of why you're not seeing the outcomes that science says you should see. Let's look at that in just a moment. We're going to focus on that piece. But in quick summary, just to give you the answer to the solution, your answer to the problem, when it doesn't work, when people aren't getting better to whatever our responses are, keep responding and be patient. Detect and correct any overall program deficiencies. Rely more heavily on incentives. Rethink your entire response strategy. Do what we did. We had NPC research come in, look at the way we responded to behaviors from top to bottom. We were doing a ton of things wrong. We weren't trying to do them wrong. We just didn't know better. Rethink your entire response, your entire contingency management strategy, and be prepared to make big changes. Reevaluate how you're using jail. You may be using it, if you use jail at all, because you don't have to get good results. At least I don't think so. There's no research that says you do. But if you're using jail, you can reevaluate it. Maybe you're using it too often, too early, for the wrong people, or for too long, too many days. It should never be more. Never be more. A jail sanction, if it's a sanction, it's never be more than 3 to 5 days unless there's a public safety, an immediate public safety issue, which requires you to go to the jail piece right away and then stay longer. But short of that, if it's a long jail stay, that's not a sanction, that might be a sentence or something else. But in this strategy, in this kind of behavior modification, a lengthy jail stay it doesn't get you what you want. For lots of reasons, the longer people stay, they get more used to it. If they stay too long, then whatever infraction they did, by the time they finish their sanction, there's too much space in between. The brain misses the message. If they are being sanctioned for something that, due to the disorder, they really can't fully control yet, then something called learned helplessness sets in, where now they give up because they keep getting sanctioned to jail and they can't stop. They can't stop the behavior. They give up. We lose them, sometimes tragically. Adjust treatment. Be prepared to adjust treatment, to make changes within your means. I understand. I've rarely worked in a drug court community that had everything they need. I worked in cities that had lots of resources, but there was so much demand that there was competition for the resources and nobody had insurance. I've worked in rural areas where there's one treatment provider, period, and whatever they deliver is what people get. I worked in communities where there's no detox at all for anybody. I don't care what you are withdrawing from. I work for drug courts where there's no accessible residential treatment. I don't care how toxic the person's living situation is. So you can only work with the resources you have. To the treatment people on the phone, to the treatment people at this training, if you are assessing people, recommend what they need, even if you know it's not available. Do it anyway. And then be prepared to say, well, okay, if they can't get that, let's try this. See if it works. That's important because it makes the case. If you're collecting that data, it makes the case to funders, to people giving grants out, to your legislature. It makes the point that we have needs we can't meet because of resources. Be prepared to adjust treatment. Let's look for our final time at how that happens. How do we adjust treatment? So first of all, it can happen, you can make changes in one of three areas. You can either change the intervention itself, like the kind of help they're getting, like maybe people are a part of one particular group and you discover they're impacted by trauma. So you add like seeking safety, that curriculum. You may adjust or change what kind of intervention they're receiving. Maybe this is a person who is living with an opioid use disorder or an alcohol use disorder, and you need to consider medications, methadone, extended release naltrexone, or Suboxone, buprenorphine, to help them. Again, maybe you need to really search to find an intervention that is more consistent with their needs, their culture, their stage of life development. Maybe it's the intervention. Maybe it's the intensity. Maybe they sort of are doing the right things or the things you have available, but they need more frequency. They need more hours each week. If you can find a way to do it. Or if you can't do it, then maybe what else can you add therapeutically, even if it's in the community or peer support or whatever? What can you add to give them more time involved in therapeutic activities? They need more intensity. Maybe they need to move from a different setting. There's outpatient where they get to go home every day. There's intensive outpatient where they get to go home every night, but they come more hours during the day. Or maybe they need to go into residential for a while where they can have a different living environment. Often the changes are moving up or down depending on whether the person is doing well or not doing well. At the end of the day, it's really important for all of us to remember that it's treatment providers who make these determinations. That judges and others without expertise in addiction, treatment, and recovery management shouldn't be deciding what kind of treatment a person needs or doesn't need. We need the person with that training, whoever we have available with that training, as close as, they may not can do all things or know all things, but hopefully they know what they don't know. And if they don't know things or things aren't available, they'll be honest about that. Make the best decision we can. But the only wise course is for us to rely on treatment people with treatment expertise and recovery expertise and who understand addiction and understand what's available in your community to make recommendations for treatment. The rest of us shouldn't be doing that. And that should determine both the initial treatment they receive and any changes that might be being made based on like infractions or behaviors. By the way, it's clear to me we're not going to get to questions. So here's what I want to commit to you. Jordan, if you can capture all of those questions for me, everything that may be coming through in the chats, send that to me. I'll respond personally by email, either directly to you all, Jordan, and you can send it to each attendee, or I can send it to the attendees directly. You decide for that. But chat any question that you have, folks, because we only got 10 minutes left, and we'll respond to that in writing via email within the next couple weeks.
Thank you, Terrence. We'll do that.
All right, great. And I commit to that. I always end up having to do that because I have so much content, so I'm happy to do it. There's lots of interventions there. There's just some examples of the kinds of interventions that might be adjusted. There are various levels of care. I won't go into detail on this, but I talked about that. Basically, outpatient, a higher level of outpatient where they come more often, and then residential. Sometimes it's moving up and down between those levels of care depending on what the needs are. Again, remembering that sometimes people need more medical related care that involves medications. They need to be placed in programs that have physicians on staff. That might be especially true if, in addition to unstable substance use disorder, they also have unstable mental illness. They may need medicine and medically oriented treatment. These are various life areas, the living environment, these areas that have to be assessed both initially at the beginning and when considering if we need to make a change because the person's not getting well. Their environment, look at the potential that they have the skills or don't have the skills to resist using even when they want to. Are they ready? Are they not really motivated yet? Do we need to do some motivational interviewing to help them become more ready to change? Is there some other co-occurring disorder that we haven't detected? We thought they only had a substance use disorder, but maybe there's something else we missed or that wasn't obvious at the time. Is there a medical problem, a chronic pain somewhere, which is causing them to need relief? Are they going through withdrawal? Do we underestimate the reality of their withdrawal that may be making it difficult for them to do well? So we're reassessing all of these areas. I want to end by just going into a little more detail on how we respond, how treatment professionals respond when a person who has stopped using returns to use. And so we call that sometimes relapse or recurrence, but it's a little more complicated than that. So when a person who has stopped using returns to use, that is either just a continuation of their use pattern, like they really haven't stopped because they're committed to recovery, they were just taking a break for various reasons. So it's just they're people who that's how they use. If they drink or use for periods of time and then they kind of white knuckle it and stop doing so. That's called acting in. And then they go back to it. That's their pattern. So when that happens for them, it might not be that they were actually committed to recovery and fell off. They still haven't yet got to the point where they're committed to stopping. And so we have to do motivational interviewing and others to help it become important to them and help them develop the belief and hope that they can change and help them develop the ability to do so once they want it and decide they want to change for real. Sometimes it's a slip. This is a person who was actually in recovery, but they drank and quickly recovered, told us about it, and they're back on the path of wellness. Or maybe it's more significant. Maybe they picked up again and their brain had almost an allergic reaction, and now they're back in full substance use disorder. When it's continued use, when they're just on a break, this is when they're not in recovery actually, or they're very early in it and they're not fully committed yet. When it's a slip, that means they are in recovery. They've gotten at least 90 days without any symptoms of substance use disorder, except maybe some cravings here and there. But they quickly learn from it. We don't have to find out from a drug test or breath screen. They tell us what happened. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to stop. And it doesn't go on and on. That happens often in recovery if people can survive it and they get right back on track. Other times it's more significant. This person's in recovery as well. They're committed to it, but this is more than a single use. They're now on a run or a binge, and maybe it's going on, and they're now becoming symptomatic again and craving and compulsive and covering their use and lying about their use. And now they're not able to show up at places. They're now back in addiction. And either way, you have to address it. The provider has to assess what's going on here because it's addressed in different ways. And you can see in your slide there, you can go over it on your own, different ways we respond to a return to use based on whether the provider concludes it's continued use, a slip or a lapse, or an actual recurrence of substance use disorder. I want to leave you with this, and this is something that is traditionally done by providers, any treatment providers who are not doing a functional analysis of what happened when a person returns to use. I want to offer this to you as a suggestion. So this is how it works. We sit down with the participant as soon after the return to use as possible, hopefully the very next day, if we can. Have them explain to you, and you're making notes, or they're writing it down if they can write it, or maybe they're talking it through, but what happened? What exactly happened? Tell me everything. And then you want to help them to think through, are there certain behavior changes, things that were occurring before they actually use over time? You see some examples there. Sometimes if you know them, you might suggest some things you've seen. They may say, honestly, I stopped, at first I was going to my, this extra group on my own to get more support, and I stopped going. You really outline these. You're trying to see what led to it. You also want to know, okay, what was the immediate thing that happened? What happened? What did you feel? What did you think right before you actually consumed or decided to consume? And then work your way back. You're trying to see what is the trail here. Because if you can figure out what led to it, you can help them prevent it in the future. And then you also want to know what happened after the use. How do they feel right afterwards? And what happened? And go forward in time after the use, including that they may have really liked it. They had been abstinent for a long time. They went back. It was wonderful at first. Invariably, they then later felt devastated. But you want to know all that. And then you want to talk through with them, all in this same session, by the way. What can we learn from this? What's the lessons from this? And what should we be doing differently? And are you willing to do that? That's a functional analysis of a recurrence. It's a standard way to respond when a person who has stopped using returns to use. So in review, when it doesn't work, be patient. Detect any program deficiencies. Rely more heavily on incentives. Rethink your entire contingency management strategy. Reevaluate how you're using jail, and adjust treatment as necessary. Thank you so much for your time. Again, chat in those questions. Jordan will get those to me. I'll be sure you get a response. Thank you so much. And now, Jordan, back to you.
Thank you so much, Terrence. And this topic is always there's always such a robust discussion that comes from it at any event, because every court and every community is just so unique in how they can leverage these types of strategies to bring about behavior change.
Yeah.
I do want to note to the attendees to today's session, Terrence and myself will take any of these layover questions, and we will send over a written response should you have any. Terrence's contact information is listed in the materials as you see, and you can also contact TLPI with these questions should we not clarify your question to your satisfaction. I do want to thank the audience for attending today, and also Terrence, thank you so much for sharing your expertise as well.
Hey, real quick, Jordan.
It. Oh, sure, go ahead.
I hope you look at the handouts, folks. In addition to the slides, I also gave you 2 different lists of incentives and sanctions that we've seen from all across the country if you're trying to think of more things to do. Go ahead, Jordan.
Thank you so much, Terrence. If you've been unable to join any sessions, they will be posted at enhancementtraining.org, at which point you'll be able to reference all of the documents related to these presentations and replay the recordings of these presentations on your own time. And thanks again to Terrence, and thank you again for attending this session today and attending our conference. We really appreciate it.
Bye, folks.
Thank you.